In the heart of the European Middle Ages, when Europe was torn by crusades, famines, and wars of power between kings and popes, a legend circulated that would mark the collective imagination for centuries: the story of the Holy Grail. A tale that unites the sacred and the profane, truth and fiction, history and myth. The Grail is not just an object. It is a symbol, an enigma that continues to live through the centuries, capable of reawakening desire and fear, faith and obsession. The origin of the word Grail dates back to the Latin term gradalis, which indicated a deep dish used during banquets. However, the term takes on a very particular meaning from the end of the 12th century, when it appears for the first time in courtly literature. It is Chrétien de Troyes, one of the most important poets of the Middle Ages, who first mentions the Grail in his unfinished poem Le Conte du Graal, written around the year 1080. In this story, the Grail is described as a mysterious and shining object, carried in procession during a magical banquet. It is never clearly defined as a sacred chalice. Its meaning remains ambiguous, elusive. But it is a few years later, in the texts of Robert de Boron, that the Grail is Christianized and transformed into a sacred relic. De Boron identifies the Grail with the cup used by Christ during the Last Supper, and in which Joseph of Arimathea collected the blood of the crucified Jesus. According to this version, Joseph was imprisoned in Jerusalem, and freed thanks to the power of the Grail, took the sacred relic with him to Britain, giving rise to a lineage of guardians destined to protect it. But behind this Christian reinterpretation lie much older roots. Modern scholars have in fact recognized strong links between the legend of the Grail and the pagan myths of the Celtic populations. In Welsh and Irish traditions, even before the year 1000, there existed stories of magic cauldrons, capable of granting immortality, of regenerating warriors fallen in battle, of nourishing without ever emptying. Powerful but dangerous objects, which required courage and purity to be conquered. It is very likely that the medieval church absorbed these elements, reworking them and adapting them to the Christian message. In the 13th century, with the codification of the Arthurian cycle, the legend of the Grail reaches its most complete and fascinating form. The search for the Grail becomes the supreme mission of the Knights of the Round Table, among whom the figures of Parsifal, Galahad, and Lancelot stand out. But the journey to the Grail is not only physical, it is a spiritual path, a pilgrimage of the soul. The knights must overcome impossible trials, face temptations, renounce all worldly ambitions. In particular, Galahad, son of Lancelot, is the only knight who can contemplate the Grail in its fullness. His absolute purity allows him to see the divine, but that vision consumes him. Galahad dies immediately after, as if having touched the sacred made it impossible to continue living among men. Parsifal, on the other hand, represents imperfect humanity. He makes mistakes, fails, but in the end finds the way through understanding, compassion, and repentance. Alongside the tale of chivalry, however, the legend of the Grail is intertwined with real events and historical tensions. During the 12th and 13th centuries, Europe is torn by bloody crusades, by the struggle between papal and imperial power, by the growing fear of heresies. In this context, the Grail also becomes an instrument of propaganda. Some medieval chroniclers see the quest for the Grail as an allegory of the Crusades, a mission to reconquer the Holy Land, but also a journey to legitimize the power of the Church and the Christian kings. There is no shortage of theories linking the Grail to heretics persecuted by the Church. In particular, the Cathar sect, which preached a dualistic vision of the universe and rejected papal authority, is often associated with the myth of the Grail. According to some stories, the Cathars guarded a secret treasure that, during the siege of Montségur in 1244, was saved by 4 men who escaped through a secret passage. That treasure, for many, was the Grail. But what it really was, no one knows. An object, a manuscript, a hidden truth. Another key element of the legend is the figure of the Fisher King, a wounded and helpless ruler whose health is tied to the desolation of his kingdom. Only the knight who knows how to ask the right question, who serves the Grail, can heal the king and bring prosperity back to the land. This symbolic passage tells that salvation is not in conquest, but in understanding, in compassion, in recognizing the suffering of others. During the Renaissance, interest in the legend of the Grail fades, but it re-emerges forcefully in the 19th century with Romanticism. The Middle Ages is idealized. Knights and their deeds become symbols of purity, heroism, and mystery. It is in this context that Richard Wagner composes his monumental opera, Parsifal, in which the quest for the Grail is an allegory of redemption and spiritual liberation. But it is between the 20th and 21st centuries that the legend of the Grail explodes into mass culture, taking on new and surprising forms. Novels such as The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail by Richard Barber and esoteric essays such as The Holy Grail and the Bloodline relaunch the idea that behind the myth lies a shocking secret, the earthly lineage of Christ, guarded throughout the centuries by secret societies and orders of chivalry such as the Templars. These theories, although lacking historical foundation, fuel the collective imagination and give rise to bestsellers such as The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown, which identifies the Grail not as an object, but as the womb of Mary Magdalene, the bearer of the blood of Christ. Alongside these interpretations, there is another, more intimate and philosophical line of thought according to which the Grail has never been a real object, but a symbol of inner research. For esotericists, the Grail represents initiatory knowledge, a hidden wisdom reserved for those willing to sacrifice everything to reach it. It is the cup of wisdom, of ultimate truth, which can only be conquered by crossing the darkness of ignorance and overcoming one's fears. Art and cinema have also contributed to keeping the myth alive. Films like Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade tell the story of the Grail quest as an adventure at the edge of possibility, while contemporary works continue to reinterpret the legend in a mystical, romantic, or political way. But beyond the many versions, one indisputable truth remains. The Grail is a universal symbol. It is the incarnation of the human search for something greater, unattainable, eternal. A journey that does not only concern medieval knights, but every individual who, in the course of life, searches for meaning, truth, salvation. The symbolism of the Grail continues to be an object of study and interpretation even in modern times. From an esoteric point of view, many believe that the Grail has never been a concrete object, but rather an initiatory symbol, a representation of man's inner search for forbidden knowledge, enlightenment, and spiritual realization. In Western esoteric schools, the Grail is seen as the cup of initiation, accessible only to those willing to metaphorically die in order to be reborn in a new awareness. But the myth does not stop at the religious or spiritual sphere. There is a historical and political interpretation that has consolidated over the centuries. Some theories, developed in particular in the 20th century, link the Grail to medieval orders of chivalry, in particular the Templars. According to these hypotheses, the Templars would not have been simply custodians of material treasures, but of spiritual secrets and forbidden knowledge that the Church would have tried to suppress. For some authors, the Grail itself could have been an archive of heretical texts, of ancient knowledge or of genealogies inconvenient for the ecclesiastical power. A further variant, widely spread by novels and essays in recent decades, identifies the Grail with the womb of Mary Magdalene, hypothesizing that she was the bride of Christ and that the true inheritance of the Grail was a secret lineage. This theory, despite lacking any historical evidence, has won over millions of readers and viewers through works such as the Da Vinci Code, reviving the dark and ambiguous fascination of a 1,000-year-old mystery. Interestingly, from the 14th century onwards, the legend of the Grail ceased to be just the stuff of poets and writers and began to creep into European popular culture. The alleged places where the Grail was hidden multiplied. From the forests of Britain to the Gothic cathedrals of France, from the caves of Occitania to Spanish monasteries. One of the most cited sites is the Cathedral of Valencia, which today preserves a chalice identified as a possible Holy Grail. However, archaeological studies confirm that it is probably an artifact dating back to the 1st century AD, but without any certain connection with the medieval legend. Even in Germany, in the city of Genoveva, some ancient manuscripts speak of an underground temple where the Grail would be kept, protected by secret brotherhoods. But, as with many of the stories related to the Grail, there is a lack of documentary evidence, and everything is lost in the thin line between legend and fiction. What makes the Grail eternal is not the real possibility that a sacred chalice is hidden somewhere, but its ability to reflect the fears, desires, and hopes of every age. In the Middle Ages, it represented salvation, divine grace, absolute purity. For heretical movements and esotericists, it was the hidden and forbidden truth. For Romanticism, it was the shattered dream of a lost chivalric world. Today, it has become the archetype of the inner search, of the unsolvable enigma, of the question that everyone asks themselves. What am I really looking for in my life? What is my Grail? The strength of the myth of the Grail lies precisely in its continuous change. It is never the same object. It is a cup, a secret book, a bloodline, occult knowledge, a spiritual journey. And perhaps this is its deepest secret, that the Grail is nothing other than the mirror in which humanity sees reflected its most hidden desires, its anxieties, and its hopes. And today, after more than 800 years of stories, sagas, and speculations, there remains a single question that crosses time and reaches us. Is the Holy Grail just a legend born of medieval imagination? Or is there really a fragment of truth hidden behind the dust of the centuries that humanity has never stopped seeking?